Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. Live from NYPL and the Brennan Center for Justice present Racism and the American Promise, Theodore R. Johnson with Leah Wright Rigueur, June 9th, 2021, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. This slide contains an image of the featured book. The cover text appears over an image of the stars of the American flag, blurring into a dark, cloudy sky which hangs above a large group of people marching on the ground. The text reads, "When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America, Theodore R. Johnson." When the Stars Begin to Fall is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide contains recommended reading from Theodore Johnson. Democracy in Black by Eddie Glaude. The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Alienated America by Timothy Carney. Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild. Thick by Tressie McMillan Cottom. Check out the full list and reserve these titles by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back to another Live from NYPL. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark, and I'm part of the team that brings you Live from NYPL. I'm here to introduce our two incredible guests today, to say hello to everyone who's watching, and to thank all of you who've joined us today. We're, of course, here to launch a new book by Theodore R. Johnson, which we're proud to be doing in partnership with the Brennan Center for Justice. Ted is a senior fellow at the Brennan Center, where he is also the director of the Fellows Program. And his book is called When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. To discuss it, he's going to be joined by Leah Wright Rigueur, the Harry S. Truman Associate Professor of American History at Brandeis University. It seems safe to say that we're living in an age of cascading existential threats. The pandemic, of course, but climate change, catastrophic wealth gaps, a global parade of autocrats. In When the Stars Begin to Fall, Ted makes the case that in addition to all of those, we need to see racism as one of those existential threats to this country. It's one that endangers the fundamental health of our democracy and the survival of the American promise, the one that guarantees all of us rights, liberty, and equality. Ted writes on this subject with clarity while refusing to shy away from the complexity of it. He offers solutions alongside the problems. He insists on a confrontation with all of the American history that has led us to this moment, the inspiring and the shameful, and he challenges all of us to do better together. His writing is very, very compelling, so compelling that you're as likely to find it in the National Review as you are in the New York Times Magazine, and there really are not a lot of people that you can say that about. We're really lucky that he's joined us for this conversation, and after you've listened to that conversation, you're of course going to want to get his book right away. And fortunately, I can offer you options on how to do that. First of all, if you have a New York Public Library card or you live in New York State and you'd like to apply for one, you can borrow When the Stars Begin to Fall for free in both physical and electronic formats. If you scroll down on the event page, you'll find some helpful links pointing you toward where you can find both of those and also how to sign up for a library card. And if you're able, of course, we'd encourage you to buy Ted's book, which you can do from the library shop. Proceeds from that purchase go to benefit the New York Public Library, and you get a super cool lion stamp inside the book, so you really can't lose. That link is also on the event page, and we will put it in the chat as well. We're going to get to our event in a minute. I'd just like to take a second to thank our partner in presenting this event, the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and when necessary, as it seems to be now, defend our systems of democracy and justice. Just as one example, if you've been reading about any statistics about the tide of statewide voter suppression efforts that are going on right now, then you've been reading about the vital work that the Brennan Center has been doing to track those efforts and keep us informed. We couldn't be more grateful to them for being an amazing partner in producing this event and all the other events that we've been lucky to work with them on. And if you'd like to learn more about their work, get on their mailing list, get involved, go to brennancenter.org. While I'm here, I of course have to pitch some other really great Live from NYPL events that are coming up soon. Tomorrow night, Jamal Jordan will speak with Blair Imani about his beautiful new book, Queer Love and Color. And at the end of the month, Sarah Schulman discusses her new history of ACT UP New York, which is called Let the Record Show. Also at the end of the month, we are going to celebrate the birthday of the great legendary sci-fi writer Octavia E. Butler with a special one-of-a-kind evening of readings, performances, and tributes. Also, next week, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture presents its annual literary festival. It starts on June 14th and it goes to June 19th, and the lineup is amazing. It includes Clint Smith, Carol Anderson, Mahogany L. Brown, Yusuf Komunyakaa, and many, many more. To learn more about that, to sign up, go to SchomburgCenterLitFest.org. Let me say that again since I messed it up, SchomburgCenterLitFest.org. Okay, before I turn it over to today's speakers, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. The library values your privacy, so we want you to know that even though the video that you're looking at and the chat you're on are on a library website, they are hosted by YouTube. So if you participate in the chat, then you share some data with YouTube and we can't control that. Also, Ted will be glad to answer some of your questions at the end of the conversation. You can send them at any time using the chat, the Google form, or by emailing publicprograms@nypl.org. He'll get to as many as he can at the end. Okay, let's bring on Leah Wright Rigueur and Ted Johnson.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us here today for what I think is going to be an exciting and exhilarating conversation. So I'm Leah Wright Rigueur, and I'm the Harry Truman Associate Professor of History at Brandeis University. Now, I'm thrilled to be here today with my dear friend, Ted Johnson, and I'm really just so happy for him as well. There's nothing like the feeling of publishing a book, and a book this magnificent, I think, deserves all the accolades and all the praise that is coming its way. So we'll be discussing Ted's new and really just moving book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. Now, I love this book because of the story it tells. It offers a blueprint for America through Ted's incredible and moving family history that in many ways is the history of Black people in America. Ted's experience in Blackness, his family's history, migration, even his experience at Hampton University, but also his experience in the military, right? In those years beyond the military, are instrumental in making all of the arguments that he puts together quite persuasively in the book. And of course, this book couldn't come at a more pivotal time. It is a timely book. It is a relevant book. Now, I'm fully convinced by the argument within the book that Black America is a model for a nation, right? A model that the nation desperately needs as well. And so with that, I thought I'd start off our conversation, Ted, by asking us to tell us a little bit more about the theme, the overarching theme of your book. Now, you've described it to me as a three-legged stool approach, but I'd love to hear a bit more in depth and for the audience what that actually means.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for being here. And I want to tell everyone that reading Leah's scholarship when I was chasing my doctoral degree was both a light for the research that I undertook in that program, but also reading her book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, showed me that you can tell nuanced stories about Black people in America that don't conform to the caricatures and the stereotypes that will help us understand not just Black people, but understand our country better. So I hope I've done my part of my dissertation committee here in Leah some justice in the work that's been produced here. So you're right that this book, I call it the argument in it a three-legged stool of three-legged stools, because there's sort of batches of three concepts that I walk through in the 9 or 10 chapters or so, main chapters of the book. So the overarching theme is this, that racism is an existential threat to America. Now, when I say this, I mean that racism and all of the things that it entails undermines the very principles and values that we as Americans say we hold dear, that all of us are created equal, that liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness are things that are our unalienable rights. But the distinction I make is that I don't think of America and the United States as synonymous. I think of the United States as the geopolitical entity, the nation state, that is only driven by its interests, not its morality, not by some moral compass or some absolute sense of what's good and right, but by whatever is good for the United States is in its interest. And that thing can change over time, as the history of our country has shown. So the United States has shown that it can live quite comfortably with racism coursing through the countryside and still be powerful and still remain intact. But the idea of America, the idea that we are all created equal, cannot live alongside racism. Either we believe that some people are better than others, some people are more privileged or should have a higher status in society than others, or we believe that we are created equal with unalienable rights that should be guaranteed to us by the state. So racism is a threat to that latter piece, which I think is the promise, which is America. The second part of this is that national solidarity is the way to stop racism's effect of preventing our nation from achieving these American ideals. National solidarity is a combination of a number of different political philosophies that describe different kinds of solidarities. But I really rely on the work of Sally Scholes here in thinking about national solidarity as the combination of political and civic solidarities. So what it comes out to is that national solidarity is when people defend each other and access to the rights that the state is supposed to guarantee when the state falls short. In other words, when the state is in breach of the social contract, then people across difference bind together in order to hold the state accountable. And that binding together is not driven by self-interest and not driven by material interest, but driven in pursuit of a moral or just cause, such as the American ideals that are supposed to bind us together. And then the last part of this first three-legged stool is that Black America is a model for this kind of national solidarity, which leads us into the next set of three-legged stools that we can talk about in the program. But the main point is that when Black people arrived in the United States, we did not arrive fully formed African Americans. We were from different places from the continent, spoke different languages, practiced different religions, different customs and cultures, but under the lash of slavery, under that repressive regime, we became African Americans. And in that formation, a solidarity arose because it was the only thing that could keep us alive in slavery and that could sustain us through Jim Crow. So all of the things, the attributes of that solidarity that has sustained Black America and that has made America more true to its principles are the things I try to pull out in the book as a way of structuring a national version of this that's multiracial and cuts across difference.
Yeah, and so I'm really struck by the point that you start off in the book, but that is a constant thread throughout, right? We can't forget it, even if we want to, which is that racism is an existential threat to America, in part because of what you say is the death of, because it represents the death of an American idea, right? And the promise of America. And I'm really reminded of James Baldwin, who in interview after interview, but one interview in particular sticks out. It's an interview with Kenneth Clark from, I believe, 1963, where he argues that the choice to continue on with inequality and racism in America is actually what will lead to the death of America, right? And then you point to an example. You give a very clear-cut example that, in some ways I was actually surprised to see in the book, because I know how long it takes for books to go into production and things like that. But this is when I talk about the timeliness. You point to George Floyd's murder as an example of the existential threat of racism and the existential threat that racism represents. So I wonder if you can talk a bit more about that, because I do think that is incredibly important. It's also a moment that everyone on this call right now, right? Everyone who's listening right now is going to be familiar with, is going to understand the kind of challenge that George Floyd represents.
Yeah. So, here's the thing. Whenever we talk about the most united moments in our nation's history, it's almost always after we were attacked by a foreign military, after Pearl Harbor, after 9/11. And in those moments, if we really interrogate them, we see that after 9/11, Muslims in America, mosques in America were being attacked. Sikhs in America, because of some of our cultural ignorance, were being attacked, mistaken for terrorists that caused 9/11. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were interned, constitutionally so, according to the Supreme Court, and forcibly so, across the country. And though we were at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy, German Americans were not interned, and Italian Americans were not interned. So even in these moments of extreme unity, racism still rears its head. And of course, it is the cause of the Civil War, the deadliest conflict on our shores. So we have seen the threat that racism poses. And what I try to do in talking about George Floyd in the book and in his murder is connect it to the founding of the country. We were a nation founded ostensibly on the principle that all men are created equal. And the original sin is often talked about, is often referred to being slavery because of the things that white Americans did to Black Americans. But I sort of pull out from there and say that the original sin was actually that a nation founded on the principle of our equality enslaved people as they made the declaration that we're all equal. And so what George Floyd and his murder shows us in contemporary terms is that a Black man is harmed, killed by agents of the state who have abused their power over the decades, especially in communities of color, especially in the Black community. And what racism in this instance shows us is the way we have fallen short. Our declaration says that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. And what the murder of George Floyd shows us is that the abuse of state power goes unchecked far too often. The reaction to Floyd's murder, the Summer of Solidarity, where people across the country in every state of the union, multiracial, multi-generational, across ideological, all came together to protest. But it wasn't just a racial justice protest. These were people in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of an economic downturn, in the midst of these abuses of state power, and in a presidential election year that was extremely divisive, telling the United States government, you are not being responsive to what we want. And I think the Floyd murder encapsulates the dissatisfaction that people have with the government. And I think we got a taste of that in the presidential election that saw the highest turnout in 120 years. This kind of civic engagement is an outgrowth of our dissatisfaction with government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely want to come back to George Floyd, and I will return to this ideally, hopefully in the next couple of minutes. But I also want to incorporate and make sure that we pay attention to, I think, part of what you're doing in the narrative of this book, which is that you tell these really deep personal stories. So certainly the way that you write about George Floyd is one that is deeply personal. It also reminds me of how you open up the book, right? This incident from your childhood where you feel a solidarity with this Black kid, this new Black kid who's in the neighborhood and kind of tag teaming against racism, against this explicit form of racism. But I'm also struck too, Ted, with how you talk about your family and how you talk about how your family really deals with essentially the failures of the state, right? So at one point, I think you describe it as something that is both compatible and tragic at the same time, right? So I want to talk with the audience a little bit and have you talk through the audience with a little bit using the example of Daddy Joe, right? Who you talk about. And so I think this is your mother's grandfather who passed away in 1966, I believe. And please correct me if that's wrong. But
no, that's right.
Part of what I think is that you make this argument that Daddy Joe's Americanness is intertwined with his Blackness. And that in fact, the two cannot be separated, that they have to be thought of together. There's that image you give us that really just kind of jumps off the page of that portrait of Daddy Joe with the two flags behind him, right? And in this respect, though, I think it seems to me a little like you're pushing up against this Du Boisian ideal, right, of two identities at war with one another, or constantly at war with one another, that are deeply irreconcilable. It feels like you're disagreeing with that a bit and saying, no, these are compatible. In fact, that they are reconcilable. And you say in one section, in that picture, I didn't just see a Black man, I saw an American man. I wonder if you can tell us more about that like contradiction, but also that compatibility.
Yeah, and this is something I try to do throughout the book, because there are parts of the book that are very theory heavy and require the reader to sort of follow me through history or political philosophy. And so the sprinkling in, or really integrating quite fully the story of my family, pulls us out of the theory and then shows it in motion, and how people lived through these theoretical constructs and how they had real implications for lives. So I trace my mother's side of the family all the way back to the first African that we know of who was enslaved in Florida, and then whose children were sold into slavery in Southwest Georgia, where my mother's family's from. And then on my father's side, who can only trace back to my great-great-grandfather, and sort of the mix of racism and sexism and exploitation that happens in South Carolina. Daddy Joe is my mother's grandfather, and he was a sharecropper in Early County, Georgia. Now, Daddy Joe, there's a picture of him as you described. He's in his sharecropper, basically a uniform, but it's the clean one. It's the one you sort of wear out in public, and it's all white with like a denim jacket over him. He's got a pipe hanging out of his mouth and 2 American flags that are angled over each of his shoulders. And you're absolutely right that I sort of, I try to recast the Du Bois's double consciousness, or the two-ness. You know, he writes in The Soul of Black Folks that there's the Negro and the American, sort of these two forces tearing apart at one another, and only the strength of the Black person is enough to keep those two things from tearing the body apart. And what I say is that struggle is happening, but it's not internal. It's actually a struggle that has been forced on Black people by a nation that didn't want to accept us, that didn't feel like we belonged or we were compatible with this culture. So the war is real. But the war is artificial. The war is socially constructed because we have been excluded from the American promise for so much of our history. And so in Daddy Joe, we can see that if you just allow Black people to be included, it just allow us to express our willingness and our desire to belong, to be fully American, that you will see that there is no contradiction in our Blackness and our Americanism. But if you insist that Americanism looks a particular way, and that there is a prototypical way and look and culture of those who are truly American, and everyone who doesn't fit that prototype is an interloper or some lesser form of it, then naturally it would seem that Blackness and Americanism don't mix, don't combine. I think that's the incomplete version of the story, as real as it may be. And if we can address the causes, the pressures that cause that struggle to happen, then I think we'll have a better conception of what America should be, and then a clearer path on how we can get there.
And so much of what you say, particularly with your family, but you give other examples too. You give actually quite a few other examples to make theory real, but quite a bit of that is tied up in this idea that you run through, I think, quite beautifully, called superlative citizenship. And I have to say, I really do appreciate you giving a name to it and then making it deeply expansive, a really expansive idea of the way in which African Americans engage in certain behaviors, right, that are really important to what you say is kind of advancing equality. Now we can talk about like kind of the ideas and the ways in which superlative citizenship is an imperfect strategy, but I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about this idea of superlative citizenship and the way that African Americans in this country have really deployed it as a political strategy for essentially uplifting the race.
Right, absolutely. So superlative citizenship essentially says it's a strategy of being an exceptional citizen, even when the state is not fulfilling its obligations to you. So if the social contract is that the citizens have certain duties to the state, like serving in the military, paying taxes, jury duty, et cetera, and the state has certain obligations to its citizenry, like protection from threats and ensuring opportunity and prosperity, then when one side is not fulfilling their obligations, they are in breach of the contract. And what Black America has seen is a nation state that has always been in breach of its side of the contract when it comes to us, but we see Black people overachieving in the realms of citizenship as a way of declaring for themselves and claiming for themselves the rights that the state is denying. So in the Revolutionary War, you have Black people literally running away from plantations to fight in the Continental Army to beat the British, not just because they want the United States to be free and independent, but because they want to be free and independent. And the story I share in the book is of such an enslaved man named Jehu Grant, who ran away from his plantation in Rhode Island, joined up with the army in Connecticut, and then his plantation master shows up at the army base and says, "You have my property." And the army turns Jehu back over, and he serves more decades in slavery enslaved and then dies blind and penniless, despite the fact that he served 10 months in the military and was denied the pension that every other veteran or every other white veteran was afforded some decades later. So in the War of 1812, the Civil War, et cetera, you have Black people running away from the institution of slavery to fight for a nation that often returned them back to slavery or to some lesser form of citizenship afterwards. When Black folks fought in World War I and World War II, we saw that they were not given access to the GI Bill to help them buy homes or to help them achieve college educations. That bill created the middle class in many respects, and Black folks were left behind. So military service is one of the ways I point to the superlative citizenship of Black people serving a country, though the country doesn't recognize them as full citizens, as a political strategy for their rights. Another one that I point out that is somewhat less acceptable these days is respectability politics.
Right.
In its time, and you know this well, over a century ago, this was a strategy really used by church-going folks to sort of use their dress, their etiquette, their diction as a direct confrontation with the tropes about Black people that said we were barbaric and culturally inferior and stupid. And so how barbaric and stupid can a people be when they look better than you in the way they dress, when they follow all the American cultural etiquette? And this served a really big purpose in the civil rights movement, because when you have these Black folks demanding rights to vote, demanding good jobs, fair pay, dressed in their Sunday best, attacked by police with German shepherds and fire hoses, a visual of that picture, you don't have to guess who the barbaric folks are in that picture and who are the civilized people. And that sort of respectability politics helped call out the hypocrisy, not just for American leadership, but for the world stage. So superlative citizenship, along with some other things, is a deliberate strategy to point to the hypocrisy of a nation that says it's about liberty and freedom for all, and then purposely denies those things to one group of people simply because of the race that they belong to.
So I have to say, for those folks who haven't read the book, Ted provides, I think, one of the best examples for rallying around this idea of the politics of respectability, which have largely fallen out of, I think, critical scholarly fashion. And I think it's a really good investment in understanding of Evelyn Higginbotham's really quite canonical definition of the politics of respectability as a utilitarian tool that is deployed largely by Black church women. And so I loved reading that part because it made me think very differently about the purpose of this, particularly as when I teach my students and when I speak to them about the students, I teach it as a flawed strategy, a deeply flawed strategy that is premised on behavior as opposed to, say, humanity, right? One's individual humanity. But at the same time, thinking about it, I think, Ted, in the way that you write about it, as a strategy to expose hypocrisy, right? With the understanding that it's not enough. The understanding that it's an imperfect strategy is a very different and very political way of seeing it. So I'm wondering, though, if you can talk a bit about the kind of contrast that emerges particularly during the 1960s with the emergence of Black power, but also a movement, a counter movement that suggests that among certain elements that the politics of respectability is old-fashioned and out of date precisely because the state continues to fail Black people. So I'm wondering about that contrast, right? Because the reality is that part of what the politics of respectability exposes is the very thing that Black people who reject respectability are really angry about.
Right. Yeah, and so you're absolutely right. Like, this is a strategy that was effective for its time. And so in the 60s, we get a lot of the Great Society legislation, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 68. And I think the politics of respectability kind of achieves its goal. And then we, as the nation sort of looks at itself and says, well, we did it. It was difficult, it was messy, but we did it. Now we can move forward. And then you have Black folks who now have access to the ballot, who can now, have a little bit more freedom to live where they want to, though money is still, and inequality there is still an issue. Then you have Black folks looking to different things, like economic empowerment. Like, okay, now that desegregation of schools is happening, now that workplaces can't discriminate on the basis of race, now we want those jobs. Now we want to be in those schools. Respectability wasn't going to be the answer to that next set of barriers to the American promise. And so when it comes to economic empowerment, the Black Panther movement, the Black Power movement, they latch onto these things, onto this on the economic argument, because the ballot had basically been secured. And so it's sort of like, if you sort of using, look, I'm a retired military guy, so that those like analogies work for me. But once you kind of take one hill, like voting, and know that the war is still on and the next battle awaits, then now you're looking for some socioeconomic equality. I mean, the March on Washington was not just the March on Washington, it was for jobs. It was about housing, it was about schools. And so now these material gains, these socioeconomic things are the target, and respectability could not deliver on those objectives in the way that just, recognize our ability to eat at a lunch counter, recognize our constitutional right to vote. Respectability was good for those things in ways that it wouldn't have been good for busing, for affirmative action, for prosecuting companies that discriminated against people on the basis of their race or their gender, et cetera.
Yeah. So actually, that's a fantastic segue. And I do want to bookmark the point about superlative citizenship being a good model for the nation. So I certainly want to come back to that, or if somebody wants to ask a question during the Q&A, I would love to revisit that. But this is a really good segue to talking about what I think is perhaps the most impactful argument that you make in the book, but that certainly, even though I know that you're not trying to be, to say this is probably going to be the most controversial claim that you make in the book, which is to position racism as a crime of the state, right? So I want to say it again, because this is big, people. This is really, really big, and it's really important, which is to position racism as a crime of the state, right? And so I think part of what you're asking, and I'll leave it up to you, Ted, to explain a little bit more about what that means. But part of what you are asking too is in asking Americans to think structurally about the question of racism, right, rather than individually, is that you are asking white Americans to realize that they need to sacrifice, right, in order to expand and to become more inclusive, that they need to embrace superlative citizenship in order to get to a good place that benefits not just all of America, but also benefits them as well. So I'm wondering if you can take us through that a little bit. And then I want to come back and ask you a follow-up question to that. But take us through this idea again of racism as a crime of the state and what you were asking of white Americans.
Yeah, so this argument comes out of just watching how race works in our society and politics especially. But whenever the word race, and we're watching it now, critical race theory, structural racism, anti-racism, all of these 1619 projects, 1776, all of these things are basically asking, what story of America are we going to tell? What's the real story about who we are? What racism does, and the reason it's a threat to us, is because it allows those with power to exploit racial difference in order to turn the people against one another so that they don't have to be responsive to any of us. So anytime people bond together and make demands of the state, healthcare, education, security, tax expenditures, whatever it is, all someone has to do is point and say, you know what, your life would actually be better if it wasn't for those Black people over there, taking up all of the social safety net resources, or those brown people who are running across the border. So if we could just fix the problem with them, you'll see that America actually works pretty well. And so this is like a really politically expedient argument, but it's divisive and destructive. And so I like to think of racism, structural racism, as something the state is responsible for. The state today and the state over its existence since the inception of the United States. Instead of thinking about racism as, okay, who did what to whom? Let's figure that out, because as soon as we know who's responsible and who to blame, we know whose job it is to fix it. And that typically means white people, you hurt Black people, therefore white people fix it, while Black folks wait for you to do the thing that fixes the country. That's not going to work. It's just, it's not good coalition organizing, and it's bad politics because it leads to divisiveness. Structural racism says the way our society is structured, the way the whole thing is set up, means that when we arrive in the society, we have different hills to climb to reach the American dream, to realize the rights and privileges of citizenship based on the groups that we belong to. And structural racism, if this is the outcome of it, means that the only way it can be addressed is if the state fixes the thing. You can't revise the criminal justice system. You can't reform democracy and then expect for equality to just rain down on us. The very structures, culturally, socially, institutionally, procedurally, all of these things need to be reformed. And the only way that can happen is if the state does it. And if the state doesn't do that, that means it is allowing structural racism to persist. And structural racism harms people. We've watched with the pandemic how structural racism has led to more Black and brown deaths than white deaths. So if the state is allowing this unequal and often lethal, certainly a structure that puts many people at a disadvantage to persist, then that is a crime. And I sort of go through some of the short literature. There's a lot of literature, but I do a quick survey of what the literature says about a crime of the state. And it fits that if the state allows racism to persist and people are demonstrably harmed by it, that it's a crime. And so in this way, now it's the state's jobs to fix it, not white people's. And this means that white and Black people should bond together in order to ask the state to do so. And the last point I'll make on this is that if you read some of the books that I've recommended in this show, like Alienated America and some of these other ones, it shows that racial resentment is connected to the increasing rate of suicide among white men, which is the highest in the country now, the opioid crisis, the economic anxiety, and all of these things, these terms we've heard, it is actually killing white people to not hold the state accountable for its shortfalls and instead look to blame other groups. And so if we can address structural racism through the state, then white Americans will also be helped by this effort.
Right. And so I think, just to bring it back for a second to the question of or the moment of George Floyd, I think part of what we saw and part of what your book helps us really think about is not about this incident or the murder of George Floyd as an individual interpersonal conflict,
right,
but instead a question of the failure of the state, because within the context of racism and inequality. So it means that the solutions have to be bigger, that the onus is on the state to fix it, as opposed to pieces here and there. And I think that's really a pretty major contribution of the book and of what you're writing about here. And just quickly think, because we're going to open it up to questions from the audience in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to think about in a very big way, because I think, again, as you guys read Ted's book, you'll see that he's very optimistic. He is deeply optimistic, and his faith in this country, his faith in the country to do the right thing is incredible and admirable, I have to say. And I'm thinking about how, there are these moments that we keep coming upon, right? The moment in 2020, after George Floyd's murder, where it seems like we're at a point of national solidarity and agreement, right? Where we can see Ted's thesis and his argument coming to place, and that we've seen it in other places as well. Things like Mother Emanuel, right? The massacre at Mother Emanuel in 2015, where we have people across the political and ideological spectrum, people of all races, saying racism must end. We seem united in these moments, but these moments are almost always immediately followed by horrific levels of violence and backlash. So in the case of, say, Mother Emanuel and this kind of nationwide consensus, we get the candidacy of Donald Trump, which is a symptom of something deeper, right? Because it opens up the floodgates for an explosion in the mainstreaming of white nationalist sentiment, right? Where we have a march in Charlottesville, a white nationalist march in Charlottesville, or we have the rise of QAnon, or Kyle Rittenhouse gunning down people in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Or if we think about, for example, the George Floyd moment, it ends with the Capitol riots on January 6, 2021. So I ask you, Ted, as we think about your solutions and as we think about, the blueprint that you've laid out in the book, how do we move away from these moments of Black backlash when we seem like we're at the precipice of opportunity?
Yeah, and this is the question before the country, and has always been since the beginning. I will admit that frankly, most of my optimism comes from the Black church. Has always been a source of optimism for Black folks through slavery, through Jim Crow. You could go to the church and find something to believe in, some ray of hope to latch onto, just to make it through tomorrow. The book itself, When the Stars Begin to Fall, is a lyric from a Negro spiritual that's talking about emancipation, but in language cloaked in that of Christianity, because you couldn't sing about the wanting to be free outright. So there's that. There's also the military service. So some of this was a little bit of an indoctrination. I drank the American Kool-Aid, and that sort of shows here. But the Kool-Aid is like worth the squeeze. If that's like a mixing of metaphors there. Like, I believe in equality. I actually think the things that are laid out in our canon, our sacred text, the Declaration, the Constitution, are important and are worthy to live up to and try to attain. The issue is that at every moment we have the chance to cross the threshold into a better America, we make the wrong choice. Like, it didn't have to be this way. And we have constantly, not always, but consistently chosen the path of division, because someone somewhere or some group of people have convinced us that America is zero sum, that if we offer more equality, or not even more equality, if we offer equality to people who don't yet have it, then the equality that I enjoy is going to be harmed or dissipated somehow. So the ideas are sound. I think the people, generally speaking, want this version of America that is in our text, but we often don't give way to our better angels. Instead, we give way to the guy on the other shoulder, the shoulder devil, that suggests there's not enough to go around, that we have to hoard as much of America and as much of the dream and as much of the promise for ourselves. And if other people roll off the edges to be left behind and excluded, then in this dog-eat-dog capitalistic society, that's just the cost of doing business in this country. And again, it doesn't have to be this way. With better leaders, with a more participatory democracy, and with a united people that are really set on holding the nation accountable for the way it's fallen short, I think we can be a better country than we are today. We may never be the utopian American state. In fact, I don't think we ever will be. But the job isn't to get there. The job is to leave the country better than we found it. And it's the journey toward being better that makes the whole thing worth it, even if you never actually get there.
Right. And I think, so one of the interesting things, just before we jump into a few questions from the audience, one of the interesting things, Ted, that you propose is that, in fact, a vital part of the solution is civic engagement, right? Mm-hmm. A new kind of program of civic engagement. And then, of course, a kind of civic volunteerism, mm-hmm. right? And participation in civic engagements of mm-hmm. sorts. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about this, because I do know that one of the things that we see, for example, the civilian corps under, FDR, John F. Kennedy in the Peace Corps, which is international certainly, or Bill Clinton in AmeriCorps. Mm-hmm. Again, these programs are not perfect, but certainly one of the things that they do is that they create a sense of national solidarity and investment in the country across race, ethnicity, gender, and class lines. So can you talk just quickly a bit more about these proposals that you've put forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrap up the book with 5 things we can do to create conditions conducive to national solidarity. The first is democracy reform, and this is something that we at the Brennan Center are fighting for all the time. This is on the news every day, the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Can we revitalize our institutions of democracy to be more inclusive and more fair, more just? So something has to be done about the way we conduct elections, the way we bring voters to participate in our democracy. So that's one structural thing. Another thing is, as you mentioned, civic education. And this is about, if we do all the structural things, all the institutional reforms, procedural reforms we need, but we don't have a people that are ready to participate in this new, efficient, fairer system, then we don't realize all the gains. And so, and this is more than just, do you know who your congressman is? Can you name the 3 branches of government? This is a how to be a better citizen. And all of the things that entails. And in Greek culture, Roman culture, they had a more comprehensive thinking about what it means to be a citizen beyond just do you pay your taxes and do you vote. So civic education is a way of creating better citizens, and so we can be better participants. National service, as you mentioned, is one, and this is also a lesson from my military experience. A lot of the problems with racism in this country, which I talk about certainly in the early part of the book, is that we just don't know each other. Our social circles are segregated, our homes, our housing neighborhoods are segregated, our schools are segregated. And so we don't talk to people who aren't like us. We don't live with them. And when you don't live around people, when you don't get to know them, then you start believing the stereotypes and the caricatures that are put out about different groups. And so that divides us. What national service does, we see it in the military, AmeriCorps, it brings together Americans from different walks of life and puts them together and then gives them a superordinate task, objective, so that they can focus their energies on a common task that's bigger than any one person. And I think those connections and the work together breaks down some of the walls of division. And then there's deliberative democracy, which is another line of study. There's like books on all of these things, and I try to smash them into the conclusion here. But deliberative democracy basically says it's not enough to vote and then forget about what politics is doing until the next election. Deliberative democracy incentivizes and sometimes mandates people participate in the making of democratic decisions and bringing people together in assemblies. And then whatever that assembly comes up with is now a binding decision for the city or for the institution, whatever. So I think just as we are compelled to do jury duty when called, I think there is something to be said for insisting that people engage in the process of democracy beyond just voting. The last thing I think is maybe the most controversial of them, but it's a transformative leader, I think is necessary for all of these other things to happen. We are still very much a hero culture, and we love our George Washingtons and Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Abraham Lincolns, these folks who are like embodiments of the best of what it means to be an American, even if they're not perfect people. And I think we are going to need transformative leaders to model for us, to be the embodiments of what the next version of this country can look like. And the idea is if we do all of these things and the right people we bring the right people, we lift the right people up and they're able to ascend to places of decision-making and power, then we've got a shot to build this thing.
Right. No, simple task. Simple.
Yeah, that's right. So, the stars have to align for sure.
Or when the stars begin to fall.
Right.
So, I've already jumped into the audience questions, but I want to continue with this line of thought. The audiences, you guys are sending in really remarkable and great and pointed questions. So I'd like to jump into another question. And this is from an audience member who says, how can we push people to understand that systemic racism is alive and well, even in 2021? Too many people don't believe there is a problem, and they'll teach their kids and the cycle continues. I'd add one other element to this, which is that we are now in the throes of essentially a legislative warfare, right?
Yeah.
Where racism, or the teaching about racism, about race, about inequality, about even social justice, is being legislated against. Right? So it's being banned essentially, and it's not simply a one-off here and there, but it seems to be sweeping across the country. So how do we get people to really think about this, or think about the question of structural racism?
Yeah, so some of this is that folks don't know what the word means. People who are close to the issue, who study it, they understand that systemic racism, structural racism, like these are specific terms. And even those two, structural and systemic, aren't synonymous. I mean, there's some differences between the two. But in the broader public, whenever the word racism, no matter the modifier that comes before it, is brought up, it means hatred. It means I hate a group of people. So when people say, America is a racist country, or that there's systemic racism in America, too many of us receive that as America hates Black people, or the United States hates Hispanic people or immigrants or whatever. And that's not what systemic racism says. Remember, if the United States is a nation state, and it doesn't have the capacity to hate. It is only interested in its interests, not in feelings and like principles. So the United States can't hate people, but the United States can be structured, and is structured in a way that, based on the group you belong to, certainly along racial or ethnic lines, your experience in America is less than that of others. What systemic racism says is that if Me and you are similarly situated, except I belong to one racial group and you belong to another. And the amount of rights and privileges of citizenship you can access, the way the state protects your rights, your ability to climb the hill toward the American dream is less steep and short and smaller than mine, then we have a problem. And the problem isn't how you feel in your heart or what your grandparents did to make it easier for your life. The problem is that me, having done nothing wrong, has to climb a higher hill, has a state that is less responsive to them, has a state that is more likely to abuse its power against me and my family and my community. That is systemic racism. And so this isn't about your hatred. This isn't about like what you think about your Black neighbor. This is about the way our society works in a way that inherently disadvantages a group of people simply because of the group they belong to.
Right. So I'm wondering too, so another audience member has asked, how do we think about solutions then? And would you think that something like reparations or restitution of another form would be a kind of solution, right? Does that fit into the state's approach to address its crime in perpetuating racism?
Yeah, and this is a great question. So I like the thinking of Eddie Glaude from Princeton, who wrote in his book Democracy in Black about this thing he calls the value gap. And what he says there is basically, as long as one group of people are valued less in a society, whatever you put in place that's supposed to be equal and colorblind and meritocratic, the people who are valued less are not going to be treated the same, that the devaluation of them is the problem, not the policy. And so I think if we were to do reparations tomorrow, the very next day, we would see the most exploitive banking, financing arrangements the world has ever seen to reappropriate that reappropriated wealth that is now in the pockets of Black people. And we don't need a case study on this. We watched the housing bubble burst on Black people first. There are whole neighborhoods in Prince George's County, Maryland, of $1 million homes that are 75% empty because the banking industry, the housing boom that was supposed to help all Americans build wealth, burst on Black folks first, and the state didn't come to rescue them. And that's because Black folks are not appreciated or not valued the same way. So my issue is this: we can't avoid policy. Policy is the way it pushes us to be better, even when we're not ready. But we can't think policy is going to solve the real problem in our country, which is that there are some groups who we still think of as less American and less deserving of the full rights and privileges of citizenship. So it has to be both. Yes, we need better policy, but we also need better character. And this is the question that's before us. If we were a nation that really lived up to its principles, if we didn't pass for the People Act, it probably wouldn't be as urgent because we wouldn't have people exploiting loopholes or creating new laws to disadvantage one group and just to win elections. Our character would not permit such a thing. We're not there yet. So we need institutions to be reformed to push us to be better, but we also need character reform so that when our institutions are ready to be more fair and just, that we're actually ready to be strong and principled participants in this new system.
So I'm actually going to ask you a follow-up question on this, because I think this is what, if I understand you, Ted, this is what you're trying to get at, this question about moral and character, which is an audience member says, how can we achieve national solidarity that is not self-material or financial interest in a capitalistic society, right? Or one that exploits its audience or its public. So, and I think part of what you're trying to say is this, that the answer lies in the moral or character question. And so I'd love to hear some solutions that you have for this.
Yeah, and so this is where, look, we're in a country of 330 million people, different races, ethnicities, religions, regions, customs, everything, okay? And the only thing that unites us is that we're American. That's it. There's no race, there's no other thing except that we belong to this nation that holds up these ideals that says are the grounding, the foundation of our country and our belonging. So I write a whole chapter on the American civil religion, which is essentially a set of beliefs that shows what it looks like to be American. It's kind of like the civic exercise, the civic activities that demonstrate your willingness to belong in the society and your adherence to the beliefs that undergird the society. And this is, liberty, life, pursuit of happiness, equality, et cetera, justice, and these things. So the only thing that can unite us, that can turn us from democratic strangers into civic friends, is a common belief in a thing. and a set of beliefs and a set of practices that bring us together. And if the civil religion isn't strong enough to do that, there is nothing else. It's not universal health care. It's not, foreign actors. It's not reduced taxes or better education or higher pay for firefighters and teachers. Like, no policy thing is going to suddenly make us love our neighbor who is not like us in the way they speak or the way how they worship or that sort of thing. The only thing that can surmount these material self-interests is something more doctrinaire. I think something more grounded in principle and morality, and not in material things. So this is, as you said earlier, it's really easy to say and really easy to sort of paint out. If we just connect on this level, then we will love one another and hold the state accountable. Really difficult to build, and exceptionally difficult to build, if not impossible, when you have leaders that are trafficking in division, that are trafficking in bringing a capitalistic dog-eat-dog mindset to politics, such that we have to devour each other in order to move forward or in order to feel safe. And there's nothing around self-interest or nothing materialistic that is going to overcome that kind of exploitation of our divisions.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one more question here, Ted, just before we wrap up. And I'd really love to hear you wax philosophical, but also bringing in your experiences, both your history, your memories, right, your familiar connections, your work in the White House, at the Brennan Center. Part of what you've centered at the end when you talk about solutions, and I think the solutions part is so critical here, is this idea of a transformative figure, right? That we live in a hero culture, but also that transformative figures are instrumental in movement politics and social movements and the successes around social movements. So what does a transformative figure look like, both in terms of the politicians that we have on the spectrum right now, but also in terms of the kind of experiences that you've gone through, the kind of memories that you've combed through, the histories that you've lived through and heard in retellings, right? Like, bring that all together and tell us what this transformative figure looks like.
Yeah, so it's another tough one, because frankly, we as Americans are often late to the party of those who become our heroes, in that we often kill them before we deify them or before we put them on the pedestal. So Lincoln had to be killed, King had to be assassinated before we recognized how essential they were, their lives were, their examples were, their rhetoric was to the progress of the American project. So I can't look around the country today and say these 5 people are best positioned to be transformative figures. And I don't know that for us to really fulfill our potential, that the next set of transformative leaders will be national figures who capture the nation's attention. I think they're going to be local figures who sort of capture a community's imagination and realm of the possible, and then it bubbles up and sort of compels our states to behave differently. And this is kind of where my family story builds in. I talk about how my name is Theodore Roosevelt Johnson, how I'm named after a rich white New Yorker Republican because of frankly a pretty racially progressive gesture. In 1901, President Teddy Roosevelt invites Booker T. Washington to the White House. But it was a political strategy by my great-grandparents to name their sons after great men in America, even though they were living in an oppressive Jim Crow regime in South Carolina, certainly in the late 1900s, or late 1800s, early 1900s, under Ben Pitchfork Tillman, who was just a sort of a really racist and ran rampant over the country. So it's folks like that who still believe in the American project despite all the evidence to the contrary in front of them. And then over the arc of time, they actually some of their dreams come true, that they actually their beliefs are there is some fruition that comes from it. So this is where I think we will see it. If we all look in our family stories, if we look at the trajectory of our American stories, we will find transformative figures throughout it that give us clues about what we need to do to become superlative citizens, how we can leverage the state's interest to advance some moral claims, and how we can build connections across difference if we want this country to work for all. Conversely, we can decide this country, I want it for me and my people, and to hell with everyone else. And if that's what you think, and I think we are seeing some of that certainly implicitly from some of our national leaders and even local ones, then this is a different discussion. We are talking no longer about America. We're talking about a different United States that, for all the rhetoric and all the clinging to Americana that folks may do, they're not talking about the America that's enshrined in our Constitution and in our Declaration, despite what the framers may have thought at the time. So transformative figures, there are some in the audience today, I'm sure of it, folks who will transform their communities, who will transform institutions. And 50 years from now, I think we'll be able to look back and point to those figures in this day and age that may be hard to pinpoint right now.
So 2 more questions, Ted. These are quick hit questions.
Okay, I won't filibuster.
The first one is from an audience member who says, are there any plans, and what are the plans for Ted to do a book tour? Where can people find you next? And then the other thing I'd be interested in, Ted, if you could leave us with maybe one thing that people who are listening in right now, or people who listen to the recording of this, one thing that people can do to advance the promise of democracy. Like, what can they do to start the movement, right? Whether it be local, whether it be national, wherever they are, what can they do to make a change? So those are our last 2 questions.
Excellent. Okay, so first, if you go to my personal website, theodorerjohnson.com, I keep a running list of the events that are coming up. So I've got 2 think tank events on Thursday. I've got Politics and Prose coming up, and a couple of bookstores, a few universities over the summer, and certainly into the fall. But I want to talk about this to everyone. So I'm talking to conservatives and progressives about this. I will talk to anyone who's willing to have me to talk about this, the promise, in order to bridge some of these differences. So that's the best way to keep up with what's happening next. To your last question, I think the one thing we can all do is to be proactive in meeting people who are not like us, to get out of our safe circle of folks and make connections, go do something different that forces you to be uncomfortable in different audiences. As a military guy, there were times where I was the only Black officer on my ship, and we would pull into a port somewhere, and all of the officers would go to the country and western bar, and I would want to go to the R&B place. But if I wanted to be like a good officer and a team player and all these things, I hung out at the country western bar. And frankly, some of my best memories and some lasting friendships from my military times are from being in those places. What I wished would have happened is that some of those white officers would have come to the R&B spot with me and be the only white person or the only 2 or 3 white people in the club, and have some exposure to other Americans that may not be like them or have different tastes in them. So if there's one thing you can do, find a group, a yoga group, a running group, a book club, or something that is not solely comprised of people who look or are socioeconomically situated just like you. Force yourself to confront, to be exposed to other Americans, because that's the only way we can build connection and hopefully get a one step closer to the promise.
Yes, so that is wonderful advice, Ted. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. I have to say thank you to the audience members for their wonderful questions. We couldn't get to everything, but I think we got to a good portion of them. They were excellent questions. Ted, we also have to wish you the best of your luck with your new book, When the Stars Begin to Fall: Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. You can purchase it certainly from the New York Public Library website. You can also purchase it wherever books are sold. Again, congratulations, Ted. And all our thanks to the audience for the questions and for the conversations, for the comments. I certainly wish we had time to answer them all. Thank you today to today's production partner as well, the Brennan Center for Justice. I'm Leah Wright-Rigueur. I also have to leave you with a quick note from the Brennan Center before we leave. Stay up to date on key issues impacting our democracy with weekly analysis and insight from Brennan Center experts. So thank you all and have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, and congratulations again, Ted.
Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting. Excellent.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are showing closing slides. This slide contains an image of the featured book. The cover text appears over an image of the stars of the American flag, blurring into a dark, cloudy sky which hangs above a large group of people marching on the ground. The text reads, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America, Theodore R. Johnson. When the Stars Begin to Fall is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. This slide contains Live from NYPL upcoming events. Wednesday, June 9th, 7 p.m. Eastern. Languages of Truth, Salman Rushdie with Taya Abrat. Thursday, June 10th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Queer Love in Color, Jamal Jordan with Blair Imani. Monday, June 21st, 7 p.m. Eastern. Let the Record Show, Sarah Schulman with Kwame Anthony Appiah. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live. The last slide shows the Live from NYPL and Brennan Center logos.